Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Vicki Janowski. I'm editor of the Greater Wilmington Business Journal, and this is our week's Wilmington BizTalk, brought to you by the Greater Wilmington Business Journal. Today, we're going to be talking with George Taylor, who's CEO of TRU Colors. As always, we'll be keeping an eye on the live feed on Facebook if you have questions and can post them. I can't guarantee that we'll get to all of them or be able to cover all the topics we want to discuss with George during the time we have on this discussion today, but I'll keep an eye on it and get to the ones that I can. In the meantime, before we jump into our talk with George Taylor, here's a quick word from our sponsors, Cape Fear Realtors.
Hello, I'm Ann Gardner, CEO of Cape Fear Realtors. Realtors support this program's efforts to connect our community in meaningful dialogue with actionable insights. Realtors are dedicated professionals who build strong, resilient communities and businesses. Work with someone you can trust. Work with a realtor. Learn more at capefear.realtor.
Just over a month ago, on July 24th, Koredreese Tyson and Bri-yanna Williams were killed during a shooting in a house off Middletown Road area. There are many reasons why that shooting and double homicide received a lot of attention. Many of those we'll get into during this discussion. But one of the reasons is the fact that it took place in the private home of a company executive with TRU Colors Brewing. And TRU Colors has been a brewery building from scratch in the Wilmington area by serial entrepreneur George Taylor for several years now, and working on a plan to combat street violence and gang violence by using a very out-of-the-box and unusual premise. And that premise is that by employing active gang members, they can have an influence on the gang culture in the Wilmington area. So in the wake of this shooting, we wanted to talk with George Taylor today to see what the reaction is from the company and what it looks like as they move ahead with their business operations. The company, after the shooting, put out a statement, but so far George has not spoken, I believe, publicly about it. So thank you for joining us today, George, and talking a little bit and answering our questions.
Sure. You want to start off, I guess, with what happened over at my son's house?
Yes, and I should point that out. Yes, when I say George Taylor, the shooting was at George Taylor III, who's COO of TRU Colors Brewing, and George Taylor, who is CEO and founder, is who's joining us today.
Obviously that was incredibly tragic and difficult for our team, and certainly my son and myself. We were good friends of Corey's, and George had been working closely with Corey over the past year, trying to keep the street safe in Wilmington. Corey was an instrumental player in that role. He'd been living at George's house for several months because, well, two reasons, I guess. One, if you have a history like that, if you have a number of felons as he did back in the day, it's really difficult to get housing. You can't get an apartment. You've got to find some private landlord who may give you housing. So that was one of the reasons. And the other is, we have a small street team at TRU Colors whose primary role it is to work every day and every night, keeping the streets safe in Wilmington. And George and Corey, as I said, George leads that team and Corey was a member of that team. And it helps when you work that closely together. It helps if you also are close enough that he lives in the house. And so that's why Corey was there.
Last week, they announced 3 arrests in connection with the shooting, and those the suspects that were arrested and charged on being held on murder charges were said to be validated gang members, according to Sheriff Ed McMahon and District Attorney Ben David. One thing I wanted to ask about, and it's something I see already is coming up in the comments from those who are watching, goes to that central model that TRU Colors was founded on in terms of employing active gang members.
Yeah.
I wanted to real quick read a couple statements, particularly from Ben David at that press conference. Said the truth is people are being targeted for their status of being invalidated gangs. So even if you are sincere in your reform and wanting to get out of that violent lifestyle without renouncing the gang and the violence at the same time, we believe that violence will continue. Sheriff McMahon, in an interview with WCT, which I believe he hadn't made a statement about True Colors before, or the model that you guys work on, said, "I've not always understood the principle of I want you to stay in a gang, but I can say 100% right now that my opinion is that it's not going to work unless we get you out of the gang." So those comments, coupled with statements from Bri-yanna Williams's family, who've also been critical of this idea of employing members from rival gangs as a way to combat gang violence. I just wanted to kind of talk those through to you and see what is your response to when you hear the criticisms of those?
So there's a whole lot of things in that, a whole lot of points in that question. I'll start with an easy one's McMahon. The sheriff, as he also said in that quote right before the part that you said, is he's never been to True Colors, never spoken to a True Colors team member. So I kind of discount that. He really has no idea what goes on at True Colors. That's not the case with WPD or the DA's office. They've been through here a number of times, and DA's office has been very supportive. They know exactly what's going on here. But the sheriff, I've never met him. So I kind of discount what he says around that. But let's focus on this idea of active gang members. Inherent in that question is that gangs are bad, right? And that's what most people would believe. And frankly, it's what I did when I first got involved in this. This whole thing got started, this whole idea of True Colors started 5.5 years ago when a 16-year-old was killed not far from, up on Castle Street, not far from here. And at that time, I didn't even know we had gangs in the city, but when I saw it, it angered me to the point where I wanted to understand what was driving the violence. The idea that somebody would drive down our streets and shoot somebody, frankly, just really pissed me off. And so I reached out to Ben David. I'm like, hey man, I don't get this. We need to do something about it. I want to meet whoever top gangster is. And that kicked off about 2.5 years, 3 years of me before we even really started getting serious about True Colors, just me being around gangs and trying to understand what was driving the violence. And I went into it like almost everyone else probably, believing that if you were in a gang, you had two primary roles: sell drugs and carry a weapon and sometimes use it. And so I understand where the concerns and the questions are coming from. However, like so many things, when you begin to meet the people and you understand better what's really going on, what I found was that assumption was completely false. And that gangs were first created in order to protect communities, but also uplift them. And that gangs have written key value, what's equivalent of like key values and mission statements that have nothing to do with organized crime. Nowhere in it does it talk about drugs and guns. In fact, quite the opposite. They stand on things like knowledge and community and growth and all this sort of stuff. They also have an organizational structure in place that we believed, or I began to believe over time, that if we could work with these guys, we could work with them to use their organizational structure and their influence in these communities and begin to not just lift the gangs themselves, but also the communities in which they live in and have so much influence. The last thing that I learned, and this was really critical, as I said, I went into it thinking that there was this correlation between gangs and violence. What I found actually was that violence is driven by two things. And this is gang or otherwise, really doesn't make any difference. But violence is driven by economic issues and societal exclusion. You take a bunch of people and you carve them off and you put them in, say, a housing project without any significant economic opportunity. It's a really tough environment. Like people like us, Vicki, have no idea how difficult it is to grow up in a Creekwood or a Houston Moore or Rankin Terrace. Like we just have no idea. I hear story after story of from my team members about them being, 12 or 14-year-old boys and growing up and mom's working 2 jobs trying to just keep things going. And all of a sudden the lights go out in the kitchen and they see their mom over there crying because she just can't keep it going. And this 12-year-old boy is like, what am I going to do? Well, that boy will begin to get involved sometimes in things like drugs and whatnot, which often can lead to violence. But the whole premise behind True Colors is this, that gangs don't drive violence, economic issues and exclusion drive violence. And so True Colors is an economic opportunity and an inclusive economic opportunity that brings in gang members. We do not make them stay in the gang, contrary to what's being said out there, although we've never had anyone leave the gang. The reason that I think it works with them staying in the gang is that if you believe the violence is driven by an economic issue, then we have two choices. We can either hire every gang member, which would be wonderful, but it's just not practical, or we can hire those that have influence, train them, get them to begin to better their lives and give them opportunities for a real future. And then that influence that they use spreads out throughout the entire group of all the various gang members. And that's what we've chosen to do. And, so TRU Colors, because of that, we hire guys that are generally high risk in the beginning. In fact, let me back up. One more thing I want to make clear. TRU Colors has at its core two primary missions. The first is to stop violence in the streets where we're active, which right now it's in Wilmington. And the second is to fight divisiveness across the country. So whether it's divisiveness around, politics or race or economics or whatever, and we fight that divisiveness by sharing the stories, crazy stories of Bloods and Crips coming together, black and white, and all this sort of thing. But the question that we ask every day is, what do we have, if you want to stop the violence in our city today, not in like 5 years or 10 years, which is what most, like if you look around the country, people who are trying to stop violence in our country, street violence in our country, typically have 5 to 10 year plans, and they're typically based on people leaving the gang or whatever, which, I mean, the evidence is it just doesn't work. We've been doing this for decades and gangs are still here. For us, we don't get that luxury. We ask the question every day, what happened last night? Hopefully nothing. What might happen today or tonight? And our street team is very active out in the streets, engaging with the most high-risk individuals in our city, and they're very successful. We don't talk a whole lot about it. To your point, Vicki, I don't get on and talk about any of this stuff typically. But the truth is that gang-related violence is way down since TRU Colors started, and I'm not taking all the credit for that, or our team is not. I would definitely say that law enforcement and the DA's office is a piece of that. I actually think it's a three-legged stool to some degree, but I can tell you right now that at least once a week we stop bullets from flying, sometimes every night in really difficult weeks, and we've saved many, many lives. We also have, I think it was Ben who said, you just can't really separate the violence from the gang generally, and that's not quoted exactly, but generally. I mean, I've got 65 guys out here who've been through our 5-month onboarding program, who used to be rivals, used to be high risk in our city, potentially could have done some real damage in our city back in the day, that now work in sales and marketing and beer and production and finance and so forth. And now are raising their family, buying cars, buying houses, going on vacation, and spreading that message and the skills and knowledge that they've learned into their community and across their gangs. And so the bottom line is, we don't make anyone stay in a gang, but if they were to leave the gang, we would lose all our influence. Like actually, and I'll finish with this, Ben called me the other day and he said, well, what would happen if you asked your gang members to denounce the gang and leave the gang by the end of the year? And I said, well, on Jan 1, we'd have no employees, because they would choose their brotherhood and their gang over anything else. They struggled and been through so much, they're not going to give up their brothers, if you would, for $1.
So that being said, then in the wake then of this gang-related act of violence, does it give you pause about, or give you any reflection then about what this model is and whether it will work or does work?
I mean, it does work. I've got 65 people here that are evidence of that, and I've got all the bullets that haven't flown that are evidence of this. We've got a significant reduction in gang-related violence. Of the gang-related violence or shootings that have occurred, there's no retaliation. I mean, think about it. Corey was a very well thought of guy across North Carolina, frankly. There should have been a war breakout after what happened to Corey. I mean, our city there should have been full of bullets flying everywhere. There was, for the most part, and I say that there was obviously the really horrific thing that happened downtown with those two ladies. And then it ended, and TRU Colors team had a lot to do with that.
But Corey's also not the only one who's been tied or an employee with TRU Colors who's been a victim or related in a shooting.
No, he's just the only one that died in a white neighborhood, so that we get all the press, right? That's actually, it's interesting. Yeah, we've lost another team member before. Nobody knows because nobody seemed to make any difference. We lost Nas around Thanksgiving of last year, which was horrific. I had a good friend who used to work here, WAP. He left and took another job based on the skills he got from TRU Colors. And he was killed in March, but again, they didn't really show up, and we can keep going back, but you won't, I don't know that we'll ever get the violence to zero, Vicky. I pray we will, but I do know that it's significantly reduced on a regular basis. And I do know that our team is evidence of that. I do know all the things that we're involved in is evidence of that. And, our team takes on more risk than the average citizen, because they're so committed to bettering our city and trying to keep people safe. They choose to do that. And so anyway.
So this is a question that's also come up too, and something I wanted to ask, but so when we say that we know, that you've reduced gang violence since this has started, which has been around 2016, 2017, how do you know that? Has there been statistics showing that? Are you tracking that, or is it
Well, so it's a little bit of a mistake to say that TRU Colors started in 2016. I mean, like I said, 2016 is when I started being around gangs. We didn't get serious about TRU Colors till maybe 2 years ago. I mean, really serious about it. And so, what we did find, and we started the first test that we ran, and this is probably what you're referring to, I think it was in 2018, where we brought in some fellows that had significant influence on the streets and put them through two months of our onboarding program. And we saw at that time the streets were hot. We were seeing a gang-related shooting event, I mean, every week. It was crazy. When we did that, the deal we made with them was, show me you have influence. This was one of the first tests that we did. Show me you have influence by, I don't want to see anybody getting shot during this 2-month period. And instantly it fell off. And it was still, even as that went on, it was several months before another gang-related shooting occurred. I was talking with one of our local politicians yesterday, who told me that the media likes to talk about how violence and crime is up in Wilmington. Actually, according to him, it's not. He said last year we had 22 murders. I think I remember that being the correct number I'd seen at the end of the year in the paper. This year we've had 6. Of the 6, there are 2 that I would say were gang associated. That's horrific. I'm not trying to minimize any of it, but in the world that we live, in the situations we're in, that is significantly better than what we've had in the past. And of those 2, there was no retaliation. Like, that's unheard of. And that the retaliation part is solely because of TRU Colors. That's not Ben's office or WPD.
So you're talking a little bit about the settings of the shootings that have occurred. So in the different scenarios and the several members that have been tied to Colors in the past. So what would then prevent, do you think, or is this possibly something that's going to continue on? What would prevent another shooting that's happening in a public setting, which is over at the brewery operation on Greenfield Street or somewhere else in the future? How can you guarantee that there will actually be more?
I mean, I can't guarantee it any more than you can in your office. And you can obviously say, for obvious reasons, maybe we're a higher probability, but no, I can't guarantee anything like that. We have never had those sorts of problems. And, we don't expect to. This is, if there was a Switzerland, this is it. And, we also, you have to remember, we have representation in this building from all the gangs in the city. We have leadership in this building from all the gangs in the city. So it would be very unusual, and I think everyone would be, it would be very unusual for that to happen. But like, this is not a situation, like we live, if you work at TRU Colors, certainly if you're like my son or myself who are active on the street team, we agree to take on risk because we, again, care about our city and we care about what we're doing and we know that it works. This is not a typical brewery where we're bringing in lots and lots of people at some brew pub or something. This is a production brewery. We have a tap room. We may or may not open it. Right now it's not. We have it because you're supposed to have one. But we've never opened it, and we may never open it. That's really not our line of work. This is a large production brewery that our main business is pushing beer out the back into across many states and through primarily chain store retail outlets. And so I think the question probably alludes to, what if you open up to the public, will they come? I don't know. And I don't know that we will open up to the public, not because we're fearful at all, not because we have a concern about that, but it's just not our primary business.
So when you mentioned that District Attorney Ben David says to you, why not just have a pledge that by a certain date you have your employees not become active gang members? Like, do you think about that at all, or is that just absolutely against where you want to go?
I mean, two things. If I do it, I would lose all my employees. If I made them do it, I'd lose all my employees. And if they chose to do it and actually stayed with us for some reason, we would lose all our influence on the streets, so we wouldn't be able to help anybody. And so, my answer to that would be more of a question, like, if anyone has a better way to stop the violence tonight, I'm all ears. Like, I'm not real excited about my son being in, Houston Moore or Creekwood at 2 a.m. in the night, and he is often dealing with whatever he's dealing with. Not my favorite thing to do, but we're committed to trying to get this to keep our streets safe, and we're committed to our city. And our point of view is, if you want to stop the violence now, you have to talk to the person that has the gun in their hand. And if anyone has if anyone out there's got a better idea that's less risky, all about it. It's not like we're fixated on active gang members. It's just the best way to do it. And while everyone says they don't like it, no one, Ben, including Donnie, including Ed, no one has ever told me a better way to deal with what's going to happen tonight. And, you think about those guys, Ben, or the DA's office, WPD, and the sheriff's office. If those guys are getting called, that means somebody's getting locked up already, somebody's gotten hurt, or somebody, God forbid, has gotten killed. They are kind of at the end of it. They are the cleanup group. TRU Colors is the only organization I know in this city, frankly, the only organization I know in the country who is very active with the most high-risk people every day, every night. And it's challenging for a whole variety of reasons, some of which it's like being on a treadmill. Our clock gets reset every 24 hours. We're only as good as last night. So, like I said, I'm not fixated on active gang members. I'm fixated on keeping the streets safe. And if anyone has a better idea that's less risky, I'll open ears. Give me a call.
We have some questions about just the production side and what's going on with the company. But before we move on to those, I do want to ask something else about the July 24th shooting. And that is, why were people staying with George Taylor III, COO, your son? Why did he have employees or friends of employees actually staying at his house?
Like I mentioned, first of all, we've done this for years. I've had my family's had gang members at their house for years. Again, we're committed to what we're trying to do, and we know it works. We've got evidence all over the place that it does. And so that was not unusual. And as I mentioned, I think earlier, they were staying there because they couldn't find anywhere else. They can't get anywhere else to stay. They've got a history. But if there's a lot of comments out on the internet we saw, especially given some of the just crazy headlines that WCT and others put out that made it look like either TRU Colors or my family was involved or doing something crazy. There was a lot of those headlines that were put out, but the truth is, we weren't doing anything at all other than just trying to move it ahead. That said, if there's anyone the one thing I will say we did wrong, and if you want to be mad at TRU Colors, most of it I don't understand. They were calling us. They were saying we were everything from cowards to criminals to killers. I don't understand any of that. I do understand, though, if you live in Providence or one of the surrounding neighborhoods, you have every right to be angry at TRU Colors and me and my son and whoever. I get that. We made a huge mistake. We've been doing it for years. We've never had a problem. We obviously did not see that coming. That is the one change we will make going forward. We will never do that again. It's not fair to the neighborhoods around. And all I can do at this point is apologize. But outside of that, the
Sorry,
other,
real quick, when you say never do that again, which part are you referring to?
we will never have gang members living in our house again because it's not fair to the neighbors. We just didn't realize it. And again, you can flame us and say we're stupid or naive or whatever, but we've been doing it for years and has been successful, and it was wrong.
I do wonder about that outside of like the neighborhood questions in terms of having them. And I've talked with you since the very early days, like you said, of working on this idea in 2016, 2017. And I remember back then you were talking about having some of the gang leaders were staying with you. And I always kind of wondered, does that carry an ethical question or issue around it in terms of, either boundaries or even just dependency on you? I understand it's more difficult for some of the employees to find rentals because of felony pasts, but having them stay with the executives or the family members personally, does that create dependency or codependency issues?
I mean, would you rather than be on the street? No, I mean, and I don't even really understand that question. If I have someone who's in need, I'm going to try to help. I don't even understand the question, Vicki, about codependency. Really, that doesn't make any sense to me. But
I just mean if they can't find housing on their own, does that create? Then they become dependent upon living with you, or in this instance.
Well, so we've never had a
living
person live
or-
with us for more than a handful of months because we help them find housing. And we have a handful of landlords in town who are wonderful and work with TRU Colors employees, but they don't always have things available. But no, they're not dependent upon us. That's crazy.
Okay. Okay, so there's questions some folks have about distribution. So just a little bit of background on the business end of it, and let us know on if any of this has been on. TRU Colors as a business entity they've had a lot of investment, both from local investors and national investors. Most recently, a major deal that you guys this spring was with Molson Coors. They were planning to, or they are, I assume, to distribute when you start producing. You have the brewery facility that you got bought and have built a brewery production line out in the Century Mills building on Greenfield Street. Originally, the first beer line, a lager, was going to come out this summer, and then the launch of that product was delayed in early July. So you want to give us an update maybe on where the actual production of beer is at?
Yeah, we had planned on releasing beer the middle of July. We had been brewing our beer on a smaller, as you might imagine, smaller sort of test system, if you would. And we now have a very fancy state-of-the-art, apparently hyper efficient system that when we use the same recipe, it pulls out much more flavor from the hops and grains and all than was expected. And so when we got close to the July timeframe, what we found is we had a beer that wasn't the right taste profile for what we were trying to achieve. And that's why we pushed that out. We expect to launch beer the end of September at this point. We brew some of it here. We also brew beer in New Orleans as a backup. We have a contract backup there just in case we have any issues. It's obviously been challenging in Wilmington. We've had what happened with Corey caused some delays for a week or two. We've had a couple of bouts of COVID that have caused some delay. We actually have, startups. I mean, Vicki, you work with startups. Startups are friggin' hard. We have an important batch of beer that's supposed to be brewed in New Orleans tomorrow morning. I don't know if you've looked at the weather map, but there's a big ass hurricane that's hitting it. So I'm supposed to fly down there tonight. I'm not sure what's going to happen there. But anyway, even with that delay, I do think that it looks like roughly the backside of September is when we should be launched. As far as distribution, I mean, we've been so fortunate. You're right. We have Molson Coors has been amazing. And we distribute through their network of distributors. So in North Carolina, there's 7 of them. They've all been incredibly supportive and stood by us, as has Molson. All of the major chain retailers, from grocery stores like Harris Teeter or Food Line or Publix or whoever, all those guys have been wonderful, and they're taking our beer. We've signed up most of the large convenience stores, Circle K and Kangaroo, all those guys will be selling our beer. So we've been very, very fortunate. We just have to get over the hurdles of production. And I can tell you, so I'm a software guy. I used to think debugging software was difficult. Debugging beer isn't hard, but every time you do it, you have to wait 21 days about before you can see if it worked, and so that's sort of the challenge. So if we wanted to brew beer today, we wouldn't have it ready for market for another month. And so that's what caused what it might appear to be extended delays, but that's what drives that.
This might be, I'm not sure I'm not familiar with what this regulation is, but so someone obviously who's watching is very familiar with beer oversight and regulation, but I thought this was interesting. Do you have your federal brewers notice yet?
Of course. Yeah, of course.
Okay. And do you guys have a brewmaster in place?
We do. We've been using a guy as a contractor for a long time, Mike. And then we've got a number of our gang guys who are doing it. We're recruiting now for a full-time person, but since we first started this, we hired a group called First Key out of Canada who helped us with all of the engineering, product selection, all that sort of stuff. And they also help with the brewing.
I know initially when you first were talking about TRU Colors, George, you had described it as will be, primarily the employees will be by primarily active gang members with support staff who are not gang members, helping teach them sales and HR and brewing.
Right.
Do you feel like that's come to fruition to what you originally thought? Is it majority?
I think so. I mean, we've got about 85 employees today. We'll have about 120 when we're fully staffed. Roughly 20 of the 85 are probably civilian, as we say. And so, the person leading sales or leading marketing and that sort of thing, typically is a civilian that's training folks on those teams and bringing them up. On the sales team, we also have, we've got a handful of civilian just sales people that are working side by side with some of the gang guys to teach them how it works. But generally speaking, that's how we go about it. Because you got to remember, a lot of these guys, not a lot, all of these guys coming in, it's not like they've worked a role similar to whatever it is that they have achieved here. And so there's a large amount of growth that takes place in the first year or two. That's how we make that happen.
What kind of questions have you been getting from investors in the past month now?
Honestly, we don't get any questions other than what can I do for you? Know that we're with you. We haven't, not one person's blinked, which again, what typically happens, Vicki, is like, if you know TRU Colors, you wouldn't blink, you would try to support because you understand what's going on. The people who typically are saying it won't work or we're doing something illegal or wrong is, they've never been here. They've never met us. I've never met them. They never talked to a team member. So, our investors obviously know our business well, and they don't ask any questions other than what can I do to help?
So it kind of sounds like you guys are prepared to kind of stay the course of what you've been doing. Is that fair to say?
It works. Why would we not? If we stop, then somebody might get hurt tonight. That seems absurd.
And how are you going to measure that it works on the social end?
I mean, we measure it by the 65 guys out here that were not for TRU Colors would not be here. They'd be out on the streets probably because it's difficult for them to get a job. We measure it by all their children and their families and all the things that they're doing. I measure it by things that I don't share, nor will we share, of all the bullets that we know we've stopped from flying. I measure it by the fact that there's no retaliation from any kind of a event like happened at George's house. Like I said, the typical, like you and I would not ever know how this all goes down, but the environment like you guys have no idea how challenging, how difficult it is to grow up in some of these neighborhoods. And frankly, the way it works in Wilmington and every other city across America is the average citizen pays their taxes so that police can be paid to make it so they don't have to see or deal with that. That's the way it goes down. But if you ever were interested and took a look and you saw names and you met individuals and you heard their stories, people would so much understand how this stuff happens, and they would also understand how to help prevent it. And so anyway, no, we're not changing anything other than we're not having gang members living in our houses any longer because everything else works.
Okay. And so besides that shift, what if anything else, did the shooting change for either the way you personally think or view things towards the future, or just the way you plan to run the company?
It hasn't changed anything in how we run the company. I'll share this though. This is because I thought this was really, it was important. It's an important thing. So this happened in George's house. It happened at 5 o'clock in the morning. And after the shootings were all, after the shooting was over, George was in his bedroom. He didn't know what had happened. And to those who say he didn't call 911 and so he must be involved, the reason he didn't call 911 was his phone was in one room and it was not the room he was in. That's why he didn't call 911. But eventually, very quickly, actually, the police got there, banged on the door where he was and said, come out, and he did, and they cuffed him, as they should have, because they didn't know whether he was involved or not, right? And so he walks out of his bedroom and he looks around and he sees what had happened because he didn't really know. And it was obviously a pretty horrific scene. And he realizes that he has lost his good friend and colleague, Corey. And at that moment, he said, if the person who did that had been there, I would have hurt them. That's how angry I was about this. Now think about that. That's my son who grew up in a white privileged environment and has only had one person that he knows that he's lost to gun violence like this. And he, at that moment, just for a moment, wanted to hurt somebody. Now take that back to like my team here, who has grown up their whole lives and they've lost their brothers, their fathers, their friends, their family, their neighbors, often 3 or 4 times a year for many years. Like imagine the amount of anger and hopelessness that gets built up in people. And that's what TRU Colors deals with. There's a reason we have a 5-month onboarding program and not 5 hours or 5 days. It's 5 friggin' months, is because we deal with that stuff and we get it out and we get people to come together and we get people to stop trying to hurt one another. But that's where all that pain and suffering comes from. Like I said, if my son can consider hurting somebody just after one incident like that, and I got guys here that have 30 probably or more. And so, you asked me what sort of was a takeaway that I didn't fully understand until that happened. That's one of them.
Okay, well, I know we are out of time on this discussion, but thank you for everyone for watching and for the questions that you supplied on the chat box. We'll have a full video then our afternoon email this afternoon along with the recap of this. George, thank you for joining us today and answering
Sure,
questions.
thank you. Appreciate it. Yep, thanks, Vicki. See you.
Bye.